On the coldest night Atlanta had seen in years, Zaria Monroe stepped into a small lounge nestled between shuttered shops and neon flickers. Her second-hand coat clung to her skin, soaked from sleet. Her face was raw from the wind, eyes red from tears she no longer tried to hide. She didn't come here looking for anything, just warmth, silence. A place where no one would see her falling apart, but someone did. 2 stools away sat Malik Carrington, the billionaire mogul who closed deals. With a nod and destroyed relationships with silence. Zaria recognized him from business magazines and celebrity blogs, but in person, he looked nothing like the headlines. He looked tired, untouchable, dangerous in a way that didn't ask for attention, but commanded it anyway. Their eyes met in the mirror behind the bar. Maybe it was the way she looked like she had nothing left. Maybe it was the way he looked like he'd given up pretending to care. He raised his glass slightly, a silent invitation. She took it. They sat in silence. No names, no questions, just the shared breath of 2 strangers, too exhausted to lie. When he leaned closer, she caught the scent of rain on his coat and expensive cologne hiding the fatigue beneath. He spoke quietly. "You look like you need to forget something." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. So did he when he asked her to leave with him. She didn't hesitate. He didn't ask her name. She didn't ask his. They walked out into the storm, hand in hand, straight into the black SUV waiting for him at the curb. In the back seat, they didn't speak. His fingers brushed hers. She didn't pull away. The hotel was quiet and cold, like a cathedral made of glass. He booked the penthouse without a word. In the elevator, she felt the heat of his breath near her ear. He didn't touch her until she nodded. That night was a blur of heat and snow, of lips and hands, of silence that said everything. It was her first time. She didn't tell him. She didn't want sympathy. She just wanted to feel chosen, if only. Once, before sunrise, she slipped away. His arm lay heavy across her waist, like an anchor. She lifted it gently, dressed quickly, and vanished into the early morning without leaving anything behind, except for a single lipstick stain on his white collar. She told herself he wouldn't remember her. She told herself she wouldn't remember him, but some nights don't fade. And Zaria Monroe had no idea that the man she left sleeping in that bed would soon be the man she worked for, the man whose house she'd walk into with her head down and her heart shaking, the man who would look her straight in the eyes and have no idea they'd once been wrapped in each other's arms. 1 year later, Zaria Monroe stood at the gates of the Carrington estate, a lakeside mansion just outside Atlanta. Her fingers were clenched tight around the handle of a worn suitcase. The wind cut through her thrifted jacket as she stared up at the towering iron gate. This was the job her friend Amina had promised, a live-in maid position with decent pay, the kind that might finally cover her little brother Elijah's hospital bills. She thought she could do anything for him. Clean marble floors, make beds, scrub mirrors until she disappeared behind her own reflection. What she didn't know was that behind those gates waited the man whose breath still haunted her dreams. Malik Carrington. She told herself he wouldn't recognize her, told herself it was impossible. They'd never exchanged names. He had probably forgotten her by the time she slipped out of that hotel. She was just another face in a long list of nights he never looked back on. Still, when the butler opened the heavy wooden door, Zaria kept her eyes low, afraid that even a glance would reveal everything. Inside, the mansion looked like something out of a movie. Chandeliers hung like frozen rain. Marble floors stretched in every direction. Glass windows lined the halls like mirrors made for judgment. The place didn't feel like a home. It felt like a kingdom. Amina greeted her with a hug in the staff wing, tucked behind a narrow hallway that smelled of lemon polish and fresh linen. She looked older, rounder with her second pregnancy, but her voice was still the same, warm, always 5 steps ahead of whatever trouble was coming. She had worked for the Carringtons since she was 18, and now she supervised the housekeeping team. This job was Zaria's only because Amina was going on maternity leave, and Zaria needed to be perfect until she returned. Her room was small but clean. a narrow bed under a drafty window, a shared bathroom at the end of the hall, and a pressed uniform folded neatly on a chair. Zarya touched the fabric slowly, wondering if it would be enough to hide who she really was. She had become good at staying invisible. She planned to keep it that way. The rules came quickly. Miss Pearl, the head housekeeper, delivered them with her usual clipped voice. No one disturbed Mr. Carrington without explicit permission. His private wing on the top floor was strictly speak only when spoken to. Do your job, stay in line, don't gossip, don't get noticed. Zarya nodded through every word. She had no plans to cause trouble. She needed the paycheck. She needed the distance. She needed to keep Elijah alive. What she didn't expect was how often her heart would betray her every time she walked past the grand staircase. Wondering if he was home, Malik Carrington wasn't often seen. He traveled constantly, Atlanta, New York, LA, always chasing the next big deal. The staff called him cold, efficient, unreachable. There were whispers about a broken engagement, a scandal too quiet to dig into. Miss Pearl said he lived like a man who locked himself inside a fortress and swallowed the key. Zarya finally saw him one afternoon from the back hallway. He was standing by the library window, a phone pressed to his ear. His posture was perfect, back straight, jaw tight, voice low. He hadn't changed. Not the sharp suit. Not the tension in his shoulders. Not the way his presence filled the room, even when he said nothing. She froze. Basket of fresh linens in her hands, barely breathing. He didn't see her. Or maybe he did. Maybe he looked right at her and chose to see nothing but a uniform and a name tag. That meant nothing to him. She ducked away before he turned. Her hands trembled all day. Folding towels, polishing windows, arranging roses that would wilt by morning. She remembered the way his breath had felt against her skin, the way he had once looked at her like he needed to forget everything. That night, Amina found her standing by the window, staring out at the lake like it might wash everything away. Don't look at him too long, she said, teasing at first, but there was a warning in her voice. He's not the kind of man you can stare at without falling. Zarya smiled, but her stomach twisted. She wanted to tell Amina the truth. That she had already fallen, that she'd fallen a year ago, in a hotel penthouse with a man who never asked her name and never left her dreams. But secrets were easier to carry in silence. That night, she lay awake, listening to the wind rattle. Her window, somewhere upstairs, behind doors she couldn't open, Malik Carrington was probably awake too. Drafting blueprints, negotiating empire pieces, building kingdoms she'd never belonged to. She promised herself he would never notice her. She would clean his mansion, wash his floors, fold his shirts, and disappear before he ever realized who she really was. But promises are just words, and words mean nothing to fate. Zarya Munro thought she could keep her distance. She thought she could float through that house like smoke, unnoticed and untouched. For a full week, she almost succeeded. Malik Carrington left early each morning, returned late each night, and stayed cloistered in his private wing or behind office doors the rest of the time. Staff said he didn't like noise, didn't like people, didn't like questions. Zarya understood that kind of silence. She lived in it too. Then Thursday came, and everything changed. She was gathering laundry from the guest rooms when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting to see Miss Pearl or another maid. Instead, Malik stood at the end of the hallway. His eyes locked on her like she'd spoken his name out loud. He wore a dark suit without a tie, the first two buttons of his shirt undone. It was too early for him to be home. Her breath hitched. Blood drained from her face. He took a step forward. She didn't move. His gaze dipped to the basket in her arms, then back to her face, lingering at her collar like he was searching for something he couldn't name. He parted his lips to speak, then stopped, his jaw flexed. He didn't say a word. Zarya dropped her gaze, whispered an apology that barely escaped her throat, and moved past him with quick, careful steps. But as she did, the edge of his sleeve brushed her arm. The touch was light, accidental, but it lit something inside her she thought she had buried. He didn't stop her, he just watched her go. She could feel his eyes on her long after she turned the corner. That night, she didn't sleep. She replayed that moment 100 times, trying to breathe normally while her heart refused to obey. The next morning, Miss Pearl handed her a folded note and a clipped command. Mr. Carrington wants fresh linens for his suite. Be quick about it. He leaves for New York tonight. Zaria nodded, hiding the way her stomach clenched. She told herself he wouldn't be there. He never was during the day. This would be routine, sheets, pillows, dust, and done. She knocked softly out of habit, waited a breath, then stepped into the room. The space looked like something out of a design magazine, sharp angles, polished wood, a fireplace flickering behind smoked glass. It didn't feel lived in. It felt staged. Then she saw it. A white dress shirt draped over the back of a leather chair. She paused, her eyes locked on the collar. There it was. A faint smear of lipstick, barely visible, but unmistakable. Her breath caught in her chest. She stepped closer without meaning to. Her fingers hovered over the fabric. She knew that color. She knew that moment. The night they never spoke about that was her mark. Then his voice cut through the silence. That doesn't belong to you. Zaria jerked back as if burned. Malik stood in the doorway, arms folded, expression unreadable. I'm sorry, she stammered. I was just. Her voice broke. He stepped into the room, slow, quiet, like he was stalking something fragile. Why are you in here? I was told to change the sheets, sir. He said nothing for a long beat, then looked at the shirt. He stepped closer, reached past her, brushed her shoulder with his arm, and picked up the shirt. He turned it slowly in his hands, his eyes narrowing as if searching for something only he could see. Zaria held her breath. He was so close she could smell that same cologne from a year ago, clean, deep, laced with the memory of his skin on hers. He finally dropped the shirt onto the bed. Do your job. He turned and walked out, leaving the door wide open behind him. She thought she heard penthouse in the hallway. When she peeked out, he was already gone. Her hands shook as she stripped the bed and folded the fresh sheets. She tucked every corner so tight the mattress creaked under the pressure. She finished the job in silence and fled the room before she could crumble, but everything was different after that. Malik Carrington came home earlier. He lingered longer in the living room while she dusted the shelves. He stood outside his office door when she passed through the hallway. He didn't speak to her directly, but his eyes followed her, like questions he hadn't figured out how to ask. One afternoon, she was walking up the back staircase with a box of fresh towels when she saw him again. He stood at the landing, phone to his ear, eyes already on her. She froze. He ended the call without looking away. You look tired. She tightened her grip on the box. I'm fine, sir. He tilted his head slightly, studying her like he could read the truth between her words. Then he reached out, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and let his fingers trail across her cheek. You should rest more. Then he stepped aside, letting her pass without saying anything else. That night, Zaria lay awake, her fingers pressed to her cheek, remembering the exact weight of his touch. She hated how much she wanted more of it. She hated that he hadn't forgotten her. And most of all, she hated that part of her didn't want him to. Zaria tried to hold the line between her past and the life she was building inside the Carrington estate. She worked in silence, rose before the sun, tied her curls back tight, polished tables until her hands ached, folded towels with precision, watered flowers that would be dead by morning. It was easier to lose herself in routine than think about the man who now watched her from across corridors like he was remembering something he couldn't explain. But no matter how careful she was, life had other plans. One morning, she returned to the kitchen after finishing her rounds and stopped. Cold, a boy sat slumped near the back door, wrapped in a hoodie 2 sizes too big, his small backpack resting beside him. His skin was pale, his eyes feverish, and he was shaking. Elijah, her voice barely rose above a whisper. He looked up, his face lighting up with a weak smile. I missed you, Z. Zaria dropped to her knees and pulled her little brother into her arms. He was burning up, shivering in her embrace. "What are you doing here?" she asked, already panicking. "How did you get here?" "I ran away," he said simply. "Auntie doesn't like me. She yells too much." Zaria felt her chest cave in. Elijah had a heart condition. He couldn't be out here alone, not in his state. But this wasn't just dangerous, it was reckless. If Miss Pearl found out, they'd both be thrown out. If Malik found out, she didn't want to imagine. She tucked him into a blanket-lined corner of the pantry, made him promise to stay hidden, and pressed a kiss to his forehead. "Bring food," she whispered. "But you can't make a sound." For 3 days, she snuck him fruit, soup, medicine, and comfort where she could. All while pretending like everything was normal, until the lie caught up to her. That night, she was balancing a tray with warm broth when she rounded the hallway corner and nearly slammed into Malik. The tray rattled. Her eyes widened. He looked at the tray. Then at the pantry door behind her. "What are you hiding, Zaria?" His voice was low, sharp, already knowing. Her back hit the wall. "Please," she whispered, the word out before she could stop it. He didn't move, just reached past her and opened the door. Elijah blinked up at him from his makeshift bed of blankets, his cheeks flushed, his breath shallow. Malik looked from the boy to Zaria, then back again. His jaw tightened. The silence between them stretched like glass ready to shatter. "Get him up," Malik said. Zaria obeyed, her hands moving faster than her thoughts. She helped Elijah stand, whispering soft encouragements as she tried to stop herself from falling apart. But Malik didn't yell. He didn't call Miss Pearl. He just stood still and watched. When Elijah coughed, Malik stepped forward, brushed Zaria's arm gently aside, and lifted the boy into his arms like it cost him nothing. Zaria followed as he carried her brother down the hallway, heart pounding so loud she could barely hear her own footsteps. He laid Elijah down in a guest room near his own wing, then turned to face her. "Explain," he said. This time, there was no room for lies. Zaria swallowed the lump in her throat. She stood at the foot of the bed and forced herself to speak. "His name is Elijah. He's my brother. Our parents died when I was 16. We've been living with our aunt in Birmingham, but she doesn't want him, and I can't afford a nurse. His condition is getting worse. I didn't know what else to do. I needed this." Job Malik listened without interrupting. His arms were crossed, his face unreadable. But there was no cruelty in his stare. "So you brought him here and hid him in a closet?" She lifted her chin. "Yes, I had no other choice. If Miss Pearl had found him, we'd both be out. And I can't lose this job. He needs treatment." The room was quiet except for Elijah's ragged breathing. Malik stepped closer, so near she could see the fine shadow of stubble along his jaw. "Do you think I would throw a sick child out, Zaria?" She flinched. "I don't know what you'd... Do you don't even know me?" Something flickered across his face. For a second, it was the look he'd worn that night in the hotel, a look full of quiet ache. Then it vanished. Without a word, he turned and walked to Elijah's bedside. He touched the boy's forehead gently, then pulled out his phone. Zaria opened her mouth to protest, but he cut her off with a look. "I didn't ask you about money," he said. "I asked about what he needs." An hour later, a private physician arrived, carrying a sleek medical bag and a no-nonsense tone. Malik stood quietly in the corner, while Zaria sat beside Elijah, gripping his hand and answering every question with trembling honesty. The diagnosis was clear. Elijah needed surgery. And soon, when the doctor left, Zaria remained on the edge of the bed, feeling the floor tilt under her. Malik stood by the door, watching her. "I'll leave," she said quietly. "You've done more than enough. I've broken the rules. Just let me find another job, and I'll take him somewhere else." "Where will you go?" Malik asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where will you hide him next?" She had no answer. He stepped closer, one hand hovering near her face like he wanted to touch her but wasn't sure if he should. "You're not leaving," he said. "Not while he's like this. He'll stay here. You'll stay here. Until he's strong enough." Zaria tried to speak, but a sob caught in her throat. Why are you doing this? Malik met her eyes. His voice was quiet, steady. Because I can. Because he needs you. And because maybe I do too. He turned away before she could respond, walking out and closing the door softly behind him. But it didn't feel like an exit. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them were ready to name. Days passed like a slow-moving storm. Zaria stayed by Elijah's side in the guest room while Malik Carrington moved in the background, making quiet arrangements that changed everything. He brought in the top cardiologist in Atlanta. He paid deposits that Zaria couldn't even pronounce. He covered everything without asking for anything in return. Every time she opened her mouth to thank him, he stopped her with a look. One that said, "Don't make this harder than it already is." At night, she barely slept. She stayed curled up in the armchair beside Elijah's bed, listening to the soft hum of the oxygen machine, praying that his heartbeat wouldn't skip. Sometimes, when the world was silent, she heard Malik's footsteps in the hall. Once, she found a cup of tea on the nightstand that hadn't been there when she fell asleep. The mug was still warm. He didn't say anything, but he was always there. Late one night, Zaria wandered into the kitchen, needing something to ground her. The house was quiet. She moved like a shadow. When she reached for the kettle, her hand trembled so badly she almost dropped it. Malik stepped in behind her. Neither of them spoke at first. He walked to the counter and reached past her for the kettle. Their arms brushed. The contact was brief but searing. As she turned to leave, he caught her wrist. His touch was firm, not harsh. Just enough to stop her from running. "Why did you run away that night?" he asked. She didn't expect it, didn't have a lie ready. So the truth came out, raw and unfiltered. "I was scared," she said. "I'd never done anything like that before. I didn't know who you were. I just wanted to feel something good. For once, and I thought if you knew who I really was, you'd hate me." Malik's gaze deepened. He took a step closer. "You left before I could ask your name." Zaria looked away. "I didn't think you'd care." He gave a bitter, quiet laugh. "I looked for you for months. I went back to that bar every weekend, until the manager told me to stop chasing ghosts." She blinked, stunned. "You remembered me." He stepped back, rubbed his hand across his jaw. It was the first time she had seen him look so human. "I never forgot. I tried. I failed." His eyes flicked toward the hallway where Elijah was sleeping. "Is he mine?" The question hit her like a slap. She stumbled back. "No," she whispered. "God, no, he's my brother." Relief crossed Malik's face like a shadow passing over sunlight. It disappeared just as fast. "I needed to know." He turned to leave, but Zaria reached for his sleeve without thinking. "Why did you keep that shirt?" He stopped, didn't look at her. His voice dropped so low it barely reached her ears. "Because it was all I had left." Then he walked out, leaving her standing in the silence, the truth buzzing through her skin like static. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay awake thinking of everything that had passed between them. Everything unsaid. Everything still dangerous. By morning, her heart knew what her mind refused to admit. If she stayed any longer, she wouldn't be able to leave. But running no longer felt like safety. It felt like surrender, and Zaria Monroe wasn't ready to give up. The morning Elijah was scheduled for surgery. Zaria stood beside his hospital bed, holding his tiny hand in both of hers. The room smelled like antiseptic and old fear. Machines beeped softly behind them, a cruel reminder of how fragile his body was. He tried to smile for her, but his eyes flooded. She leaned over, kissed his forehead, whispered promises she didn't know if she could keep. Malik arrived just before dawn. He wore a dark coat, gloves, and that same unreadable expression that always made her wonder what he was holding back. He didn't say much, he didn't have to. He walked over to Elijah, rested his hand on the boy's shoulder, and nodded to Zaria like he meant every silent word between them. When the nurses came in to wheel Elijah out, Zaria kissed her brother's cheek one last time, praying the tears wouldn't fall until after the door had closed. Malik stood back, hands in his coat pockets, watching her with an intensity she could feel under her skin. She didn't know how long he stayed after Elijah was gone, but when she turned to sit in the waiting room, he was right there beside her. They didn't speak. For hours, she sat hunched in a cold plastic chair, twisting her fingers together, while Malik stood near the window, watching the grey sky, his phone long forgotten in his pocket. Every few minutes, his eyes drifted back to her, and every time they did, she felt a little less alone. Finally, the surgeon stepped through the doors. Zaria jumped to her feet. Her knees nearly gave out. The doctor's smile was tired but real. "He'll be okay. The surgery went well." Zaria exhaled so hard, it felt like something cracked open in her chest. She almost collapsed. But Malik was suddenly there, his arm wrapping around her waist, to hold her steady. She leaned into him before she could stop herself. Just for a second. Just long enough to breathe. When she tried to thank him, the words caught in her throat. She couldn't speak. She didn't have to. He touched her cheek gently, like he might say something, but then his phone buzzed in his pocket, and he stepped away to take the call. She turned her back so she wouldn't have to see him put the mask on again. Later that night, they brought Elijah back to the estate for recovery. Private nurse stayed in the guest room. Zaria refused to sleep anywhere but in the armchair beside his bed. Malik didn't argue. He checked on them often, usually late at night when the halls were quiet. Sometimes he brought tea. Sometimes he just stood in the doorway watching Elijah sleep, and Zaria pretends she wasn't falling deeper than she ever meant to. For a few days, peace hovered like fog over the mansion. Then came the warning. Zaria entered the kitchen one morning and found Miss Pearl waiting, arms folded, eyes hard. "You need to be careful," she said quietly. "A maid who catches the master's eye too often won't be a maid much longer." Zaria's heart thudded. "It's not like that," she said. Miss Pearl shook her head slowly. "I've seen this story before. He may not mean to hurt you, but men like him only love what they can control. And when you stop being new, when you stop being easy to hide, he will remember who he is." Zaria left the kitchen before the tears could rise. She hated that the warning echoed the fear already buried in her chest. That night, she sat beside Elijah's bed, watching him sleep peacefully for the first time in months. She traced the line of his cheek and wondered if this peace was real, if it could last, if she was strong enough to walk away when the time came. By dawn, she had made her decision. She would leave, not yet, but soon. After Elijah had healed, after the debt of his life had been repaid, she couldn't stay. She wouldn't survive loving a man like Malik Carrington. But plans made in the dark rarely survive the morning. 2 nights later, everything fell apart. Zaria hadn't meant to end up in Malik's study. She was searching for a staff ledger Miss Pearl had asked her to find. But when she opened the heavy oak door, she found him sitting behind his desk, sleeves rolled, drink half full in one hand, the other running through his hair like he'd been dragging thoughts in circles for hours. "Come in, Zach." His voice was low, hoarse, not commanding like usual. Something about it made her chest tighten. She stepped inside, file pressed tight against her chest. She tried not to stare at the way his jaw tensed or how the light caught the tired in his eyes. "Do you hate me?" he asked suddenly. Her lips parted, but she didn't speak. He stood slowly and came around the desk, stopped inches from her. "Do you hate that I made you stay? That I brought your brother here? That I kept you when you wanted to run?" She dropped the file. Papers scattered around their feet. "I don't hate you," she whispered. "I hate that I don't." Malik lifted his hand and brushed a tear from her cheek she didn't know had fallen. "Who says we can't be anything?" His words cracked her wide open. "You don't know me," she said softly. He laughed. Not with humor, but something broken. "I know you more than I know myself." He tilted her chin until her eyes met his. "You think I don't remember that night? You think I didn't recognize you the second I saw you in this house? You left before I could even ask your name, but you never left me, Zaria. I couldn't find you because you didn't want to be found." Her chest ached with the weight of truth. He kissed her before she could respond. It wasn't soft, it wasn't careful, It was everything they'd held back, everything they'd buried, everything they were still afraid of. She melted into him for one breath, then two, then pulled away, whispering the only word that mattered: Elijah. Malik rested his forehead against hers. He's asleep. He's safe. So are you. She wanted to say no, wanted to remind him of everything that stood between them. But when he kissed her again, every reason slipped from her mind like smoke. That night, she didn't sleep in the chair by Elijah's bed. She didn't sleep at all. She lay tangled in Malik's sheets, her cheek on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart pounding louder than her doubts. But, by morning, reality came back with the sun. She slipped out of bed while he slept, dressed quietly, and tiptoed down the hallway to check on Elijah. He was still asleep, peaceful, his chest rising and falling in rhythm with hers. She kissed his forehead, brushed a curl from his face, and sat beside him for a while, just watching. Downstairs, the kitchen was too quiet. Miss Pearl was already there, holding a mug, eyes sharp even at dawn. "He will break you," she said without warning. Zaria froze. "He's not like that," she said, voice small. "Maybe not now. But wait until he forgets. Men like him always forget." Zaria didn't answer. She walked away before the sting behind her eyes turned into tears. She stepped out onto the back terrace, the cold biting at her skin like it had every day since she arrived. She wrapped her sweater tighter, not to fight the wind, but to hold herself together. Then she felt it, his hand on her shoulder, warm, grounding. "You always run from my bed to the cold," Malik said, voice rough with sleep. She didn't turn. "Maybe I like the cold." He stepped behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, pulled her back against his chest. "Or maybe you're afraid of the heat." She leaned into him without thinking. He kissed her temple. "Stay for how long?" Malik turned her to face him. "For as long as you want." She wanted to say yes. She wanted to believe it. But before she could speak, the sound of tires crunching across the gravel stopped them both. A sleek black car pulled into the drive. Zaria turned toward it, instinct already tensing her spine. The passenger door opened. A tall, elegant woman stepped out in a coat worth more than Zaria's entire wardrobe. Her hair was perfectly sculpted. Her heels didn't even wobble on the stone path. Her eyes locked on Malik first, then Zaria, and stayed mother. Malik said tightly. Zaria's breath caught. Vivian Carrington walked like she owned every inch of space between her and her son. "So this is where you've been hiding?" "What do you want?" Malik asked. "Wanted to see my son. I wanted to understand why you stopped answering my calls. And why the staff says you're playing house with the help." Zaria took a step back. Malik's hand found hers behind his back, squeezed. A warning. "Don't say a word." Vivian's eyes narrowed. "You think she lasts? A girl like her, you'd think she can handle this family." "She's not your concern," Vivian laughed, cold and clean. "Everything about you is my concern, especially when you threaten the name we built." She leave Malik, just like they all do. Zaria opened her mouth to speak. "I never." Vivian cut her off with a wave of her hand. "Spare me. I know exactly why you're here. Girls like you always want something, a name, a check, a baby to tie him down." Zaria flinched. Malik stepped forward, blocking his mother's line of sight. "That's enough." Vivian's voice dropped to a whisper. "You'd choose her over your own mother?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. Zaria's heart cracked. Vivian's eyes cut toward her. "One last time. Then keep her. But don't expect me to clean up the mess." She turned and left without another word. The silence she left behind was heavier than anything she'd said. Malik turned to Zaria, his jaw clenched. "Don't listen to her." "Maybe she's right," Zaria whispered. "Maybe this is a mistake." He stepped closer. "Do you want to leave?" Her lips trembled. "No." "Then don't." He wrapped his arms around her. She sank into him, buried her face in his chest, and tried to breathe through the fear. "You're mine, Zaria," he said. "You've been mine since that first night." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. But that night, she packed a bag again, and left it under the bed untouched, because part of her still believed. He meant it, and part of her knew some dreams are too dangerous to trust. A month passed. The ice on Carrington Lake thawed, revealing silver ripples that shimmered beneath a sky just beginning to hint at spring. The mansion, once cloaked in silence and snow, now echoed with quiet laughter and soft footsteps. Zarya stood barefoot on the back terrace, her curls loose around her shoulders, watching Elijah run across the lawn with a bright orange kite fluttering. Behind him, his laughter rang like music. It filled the air, it filled her chest. A month ago, she didn't know if he'd survive the surgery. Now, he was chasing the wind like it had never tried to steal his life. Behind her, the sliding door opened. Malik stepped out with 2 mugs of coffee, handing one to her without a word. He stood beside her as their hands brushed. Then, without asking, he interlaced his fingers with hers. She didn't pull away. They hadn't spoken about his mother since the confrontation. Vivian had returned to her penthouse in New York, her sharp words echoing behind her but holding no more power. Malik hadn't looked back. He'd drawn a line, and for once, Zarya felt like she wasn't standing alone on her side of it. Instead, Eleanor Carrington, his grandmother, had visited. She'd kissed Zarya on the cheek and whispered, "You look tired, baby, get some rest." The softness in her voice undid Zarya more than any warning ever had. Rest was something she still didn't understand, but she was learning. Elijah was stronger each day. He laughed louder, slept easier. Sometimes, he tugged on Malik's sleeve, calling him to help with homework, or launch his kite, or fix whatever he decided needed. Fixing that day, Malik never said no. He just knelt down in his dress clothes and let the boy climb over him like he was made of something unbreakable. Zarya watched them, and something warm settled in her chest, heavy, slow, undeniable. That evening, they ate dinner in the sunroom where glass walls caught the last gold of the day. Zarya sat between Malik and Elijah, listening to their voices wrap around her like a promise. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. It was the first time she didn't feel like a visitor in someone else's life. After Elijah fell asleep, Malik led her outside again. Down the narrow stone path, past the trimmed hedges, all the way to the small wooden dock that stretched into the lake. The water was quiet, so was he. They stood side by side under the moonlight. Zarya watched the silver reflection ripple under their feet. "I'm not good with words," Malik said finally. Zarya smiled gently. "I know." He let out a breath, slow and heavy. "That night in Atlanta, you looked at me like I was a man. Not a name, not a brand, just a man." She didn't answer. She couldn't. He turned toward her. The moonlight caught his face, his eyes. The vulnerability he almost never let anyone see. "You left before I could thank you for that." She shook her head. "I never wanted anything from you." "I know," he said quietly. "That's why I want to give you everything." He reached into his coat pocket, dropped to one knee, and the world stopped spinning. The ring was simple. Gold, a single diamond. Small but catching the moon like a secret only they could share. Malik looked up at her with none of the armor he usually wore. "Marry me, Zarya. Stay with me. Stay with us." Tears blurred her vision before she could blink them away. "Yes." Her voice cracked open like light through a window. "Yes." He rose and pulled her into him. His kiss was soft this time. Full of hope, instead of hunger. Full of everything they'd been too afraid to say out loud behind them. The lights from the mansion glowed in the windows. Warm, steady. Elijah slept safe in his bed, and Zarya knew, with her whole heart, that she was finally home. Not because of the marble floors or the private doctors or the lakefront view, but because Malik Carrington had once been a stranger in a bar on the coldest night of her life, and now he stood beside her, strong enough to hold everything she thought was unworthy of love. The wind rolled soft over Carrington Lake as spring bloomed in full. Trees rustled with new green, and the last frost melted away from the garden's edge. Inside the house, laughter echoed. Not the sharp, forced kind Zarya had grown used to over the years, but something round and real. Full of breath, full of life, Elijah was thriving. He no longer shuffled slowly down the halls or clung to her like he might vanish. Now he sprinted, barefoot through the yard, calling for Malik to chase him, daring the wind to keep up. Sometimes he wore Malik's old hoodie like a badge of honor. Sometimes he fell asleep, curled on the couch beside him, head against his side. Trust worn on his face like sunlight. Zaria watched it all unfold, and still couldn't quite believe it. She had stopped looking over her shoulder, stopped worrying about hiding. Malik had made sure of it. Every day he showed her, in small ways, that this wasn't a favor, or a fling, or a phase. This was his life now, and she was at the center of it. He built her a small studio behind the rose garden. It had big windows and soft floors and walls painted in her favorite warm gray. When she'd asked him why, he said, "Because you've spent your life giving everything away. I wanted to give you something no one could take." She didn't have the words to respond, but she had him. And that was enough. Eleanor Carrington visited often. She brought stories, warmth, and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Once, she placed a hand on Zaria's shoulder and said, "I see the way he looks at you, baby girl, and I've never seen my grandson more sure of anything." Miss Pearl never apologized. But one evening, she brought Zaria a small box of Elijah's favorite ginger cookies with no explanation. And Zaria smiled because sometimes silence says more than words. They didn't speak of Vivian anymore. Her absence was her answer, and they let her stay gone. On warm afternoons, Malik walked with Zaria along the edge of the lake. Sometimes they didn't say a thing. Sometimes he pulled her hand to his chest and just held it there, like a reminder. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon and turned the lake gold, Elijah ran ahead of them with a paper kite stitched from scraps Zaria had saved from her old coat. It fluttered wildly, high above the trees, dipping and soaring. "He's not scared anymore," she whispered. Malik squeezed her hand. "Neither are you," and she wasn't. Not of love, not of being seen, not of staying. They would marry in the garden that summer, barefoot on the grass, with Elijah holding the ring like a prince on a mission. The mansion wasn't just a job now. It wasn't a cage. It was a place where laughter belonged in the halls, where black joy echoed off marble walls and touched every window, where love wasn't borrowed. It was built every day, in every kiss, every promise, every quiet morning where coffee was poured in silence and shared with a glance. Zaria Monroe had once believed she was only meant to survive. Now she knew she was meant to live, to love, to be loved back. She would never run again, because she had finally found her home, not in chandeliers or estates, but in the steady hands of a man who once stood in the dark with her. A man who stayed,